I'm an anthropologist at Oxford, just a doctoral student, and my paper is titled Miscommunicating Across Borders, Ethnographic Reflections on EU Techniques of quote-unquote better communication from Brussels. And the paper analyzes discourses surrounding dialogue and better communication among civil servants who are working in the European Commission in Brussels, drawing on ethnographic fieldwork I conducted there for around 18 months. And it explores how the institution seeks to fill the dialogical spaces concurrently occupied by populist voices in order to reaffirm the legitimacy and underpinning the existence of the EU and of a supranational community of Europeans who might identify with and belong to it. And so in this case, I hope it provides somewhat of a segue to the next session on populism. So the data I collected, I did so primarily through face-to-face interviewing. I did 56 interviews with civil servants there, bureaucrats who work in 16 policy departments or directorates general, as they call them there. And I supplemented these methods with discourse analysis of official texts, speeches, and press briefings. And so the main body of what I'll talk about today will encompass three sections which focus on three different discourses I encountered in the field. The first will provide a bit of context about what was going on while I was there, and the discourse of crisis, which was a word that was very much on everyone's lips. And secondly, the discourse of politics and what it means to be more political in administration. And lastly, the discourse of better communication. And my findings will suggest that the achievement of better communication with citizens by the EU Commission is made more intractable by its struggle to communicate an institutional European identity that is at the same time inclusive, coherent, persuasive, and distinct. So the European Commission is the executive power of the EU, which oversees the implementation of decisions by the Parliament and Council. It proposes new policies and initiatives, monitors the budget, and safeguards the treaty. It also acts as the EU's public face and represents the collective quote-unquote European interest of all of its members and citizens. And my arrival in the field occurred at a time of what was perceived to be a high adversity for the EU and high distrust in EU institutions, much of which is perhaps still going on now. And it coincided with the commencement of the Juncker Commission, the commissions under President Juncker's first and only term in office. And he went into power by announcing that his would be a last chance commission at a quote unquote make or break moment for the EU, preoccupied with a couple of multiple and overlapping crises. There was the Greek financial crisis, the height of the refugee slash migration crisis, as well as terror attacks in many European cities, including Brussels. There was, as far-right parties promoting nationalism and nativism began to gain unprecedented support in countries like Hungary, Poland, and Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and France. And the period reached a nadir, I think, with the Brexit vote in Britain, which, as much as economic realities, did have to do with dialogue and identity and what it means to accept or reject or passively disregard what it means to belong to the EU. And it also controverted a basic principle of European integration, which was that the movement towards ever closer union was irreversible, and it proved that it's possible for the EU to shrink as well as grow in its lifetime. So when Juncker got into power, he announced that his commission would be quote unquote more political than those before it. And because of the EU's placement in the realm of European politics in general, one would think that the Commission was already a political body, of course. So I wanted to investigate what this word meant in this context in particular. And I discovered that to be more political touches on duality, which shapes the everyday reality of the work that Commission bureaucrats do, which fluctuates between two poles of the political on one side and what they call the administrative or technocratic on the other. As one official says, we have this hybrid function. Work is quite technical. It's very technocratic, but it's highly political at the same time. So these two poles are understood somewhat in opposition to one another. The administrative and technocratic connotes the highly specialized areas of expertise in which officials are trained and remain focused for long periods of time, whereas the political dimension encompasses a sort of shared leadership role that everyone has in common. It also, this move to be more political coincides with something the president said, which was, I want to be big on the big things and small on the small things. And this coincides with a program entitled Better Regulation, in which the EU, in which the Commission specifically put forth fewer and fewer policy proposals each year. So in 2015, 55 EU laws were adopted by Parliament as compared to 64 in 2010. And the president said that citizens want Europe to improve their lives, not meddle with them. Businesses want Europe to enhance their competitiveness, not burden them with red tape. So this idea of being big on the big things and small on the small things, the Commission commits itself to achieving results on a limited range of issues that are of the greatest import, and retreating from certain fields where it is perceived to be ineffective or meddlesome in people's lives. So to be political in this sense is to be in fewer places where it matters rather than in many places all at once. And when enumerating the Commission's role on the EU stage, informants often include one that is not in the treaties, the way it acts as a scapegoat, or the sort of whipping boy on which all of Europe's problems are pinned. This is a phenomenon known in Brussels as Brussels blaming. A lot of national level representatives will come to Brussels and say one thing and then return back home to their capitals and say something else. And in this way, Brussels has become a metonym for an impressive political system, and which tricked nations into joining this European project, and which tolerates little dissent from them. As one official explains, the biggest criticism everyone has of the EU is it's about some faceless bureaucracy. You have to confront that stuff, not run away until something like Brexit blows up in your face. Another strong criticism is the so-called democratic deficit of the EU, which signifies an overreach of power by its institutions, as well as a lack of participation and dialogue with citizens in the European project. And so the officials I've spoken to are the unelected technocrats that are bemoaned from national capitals and out of the mouths of people like Nigel Farage. But when I talk to them about it, for them, they readily acknowledge that, of course, they're not elected politicians. However, they see what is lost in terms of democratic legitimacy is gained in the form of accountability. They see this as a good thing, because when a policy is launched, they can keep busy on their agendas without having to go back to voters every 4 or 5 years, and thus see this as a mark of excellence of the system as opposed to a flaw. And so if the Commission cannot engage citizens directly, it does so indirectly via the various lobbying and interest groups around them. Officials chair what is called social dialogues, where they engage different social partners and representatives of 40 or so sectors and solicit their perspectives on the challenges in their respective spheres. As one official explains, as a slight compensation for the democratic deficit, we will talk to anybody. People appoint themselves to fill the gap, and that's part of what you see around Brussels and all the plethora of lobbyists and interest groups. They're welcomed at our doors simply because, in the absence of clear democratic mediation, we will take anybody's ideas. We will dialogue with anybody. And so that he cites the lobbying culture in Brussels as an antidote to the deficit is interesting, given how the lobbying industry in general is widely viewed, of course, as a barrier to democracy and symptomatic of a more oligarchical pay-to-play politics that works in the interests of the wealthy and few. Now, underlying the democratic deficit is a perception that the EU is undemocratic because, first and foremost, it lacks a coherent and identifiable European demos or populace. Collective identifications with and belongings to a shared community of citizens is a critical source of legitimacy for democratic institutions of governance. And in this way, the EU executive acts to greater and lesser degrees as an institutional locus for the production of European identity and belonging. Um, However, officials understand that embracing the idea of Europe as a supranational community can prove to be challenging for many people in national and local contexts outside of Brussels, of course, where lingering attachments to nations and regions endure. As one official explains, people probably feel that the most important aspect of their identity is their national identity. You're concerned about the people in your home and in your country more than others. It's your country, your people. And this absence of a European demos is further attributed in part to the non-existence of a European public square, an open forum where dialogue among many different members of this imagined community can take place above and across national borders. The media outlets which cover the day-to-day developments coming out of Brussels reach limited audiences, while national media foreground, of course, the domestic issues and debates. And one official says, as long as the first pages of the newspaper and the first minutes of the TV news will still be massively dedicated to domestic issues, you can say there is no such thing as a European demos, a space where genuine European issues are discussed, taking into account the European dimension of them for what it is. There's likewise a temporal issue to the work that the officials do in the Commission. The European semester cycle is perceived as being odds with the communication timeline and clashes with the more internal day-to-day rhythms that obstruct the institution's ability to represent itself and its actions to the outside world. So officials see a mismatch with the work they produce and for people seeing the need for the work they do to be done. As one official explains, we come up with something and we haven't really explained to people what the problem was in the first place. So as a result, citizens remain oblivious to the concrete achievements of the Commission's work. And by the time policies are fully implemented and made real, so to speak, most citizens have forgot all about the announcement in the first place, if they had ever heard it to begin with. There has been several attempts by the Commission to carve out an identity for itself, which is delimited yet inclusive of all 500 million citizens at once. These are projects titled A Soul for Europe from 2006, A New Narrative for Europe in 2013. And these are quote unquote strategic communication projects that attempt to define a philosophical basis for looking at Europe in a new way and articulate what Europe stands for. And so central to the political turn is the concern with institutional visibility. The Commission is not simply more political, it is more visibly communal, one which presents and represents itself more effective to public audiences. And so more examples of these better communication initiatives are the European Citizens Initiative, which facilitates the involvement of civil society in EU decision-making, and has been a formative strategy of legitimizing the institutions. Nevertheless, my informants concede that European identities tend to be more abstract in character than our identifications with nations and regions, and that the EU identity lacks concrete reference points in which to anchor itself, such as a language, a history, prominent visual symbols, sovereign governments, and a territory with discrete borders. Now just to move on to my conclusions, by formulating and formalizing in basic terms a coherent identity that is distinctive and delimited, social organizations reimagine the bonds of belonging that hold themselves together and the boundaries that distinguish themselves from other institutions. The crises of democracy, legitimacy, and visibility in the EU intersect at the inability of institutional Europe to define a coherent and viable identity for itself. The political turn or the repoliticization of the Commission constitutes part of a set of efforts to refashion its image in the face of a crisis of legitimacy within EU institutions, one which is itself linked to weak levels of identifications with them among citizens. Such exercises in institutional rebranding aim to redress the balance in the political/technocratic dialectic in order to counteract an image of the EU civil service as one staffed by faceless, unelected technocrats. However, the Commission's image as a soulless and faceless bureaucracy profoundly restricts its capacity to define itself in a way that is inclusive, coherent, compelling, and distinct. As a result, the EU asserts its identity only in terms that are broad enough to encompass all the varieties of social and linguistic life into a single supranational rubric. The resulting identity that comes out stretches itself too thin and falls apart in its efforts to elide difference and combine unlike with unlike. The absence of EU identity thus inhibits the establishment of platforms for transnational dialogue between institutions and citizens. And the absence of such direct channels of communication, in turn, obviates the formulation of a dialogical EU identity. Thank you.